All right, so this is basic HTML and CSS part 2, again with myself and Jerry Humphrey.
Hi, everyone.
Today, basically, here's what is going to be new in this training, building upon what we did in part 1. We're going to talk a little bit about doc type declarations, if you've ever been confused as to what those are and why they're there, etc. We're going to cover that. We're also going to get into divs. I know a lot of people asked about divs after last training, and we're gonna get into divs today. Basically, divs allow you to do a number of different things, but primarily they're used to create certain divisions or certain container areas of a particular web page layout. We're also going to get into more CSS styling. We're going to do some styling of IDs, some styling of classes, and some different types of CSS styling anyway in regards to basically what's referred to as the selector. We're going to get more in depth, not just trying to style the actual HTML element like an H1 or a paragraph. We're actually going to start kind of getting a little bit more advanced on that particular topic. We're also going to talk just a little bit more about HTML entities. We did talk a little bit about them in the last. We're going to talk a little bit more about them in this one. We're going to introduce HTML comments, what they are, how they're created basically, and why they're used. Same thing with CSS comments. They're formed a little bit differently. We'll demonstrate those live and show you a little bit of how they're used. Specifically, they can be used for a lot of things, but one of the cool things they can be used for is CSS debugging, and I'm going to show you that here live too. So with that, let's jump right into it. That's pretty much it for the PowerPoint. We are back over. I guess I can just delete that altogether. We're back over to this page here. So this is the page that we're going to build. We're going to start obviously from just raw text and handle all of this styling, basically creating a simple yet clean looking mini site type sales page that's obviously still in use all over the place. So once you go through this webinar, you're going to have a strong understanding as to how to build these type of sites. So kind of starting from the top, in this main area in the background, you can see that there's a light gray color, and of course this could be any color that you wanted it to be. It's just a CSS color. It's not built with an image, and you can change it at a whim and on the fly. But you'll notice that the light gray color is entirely in the background all the way to the very bottom of the site or page. This is the body area of the code. The body area is controlling the light gray background color. In the center, right, we've got this area that looks kind of like a sheet of white paper, which is its intent. It's meant to look that way. That's basically the concept of a mini site or sales page type layout. And you can tell that it is has a white background. It does have a dark thin line border, which you can style that many different ways, but that's what I've chosen for this exercise. This area here, the white area with the dark line border, is our first div. It's our first division. So there's a number of different ways. You don't have to label it the same. You'll see it. A lot of people will call it the main container, or some people will call it content. You'll see that when we create divs, both IDs and classes, we have the ability to actually name them ourselves, name them uniquely. This is something new that's part of this training that wasn't part of last. Before, we were only dealing with HTML entities. So if you wanted to style something as an H1 heading, it had to be H1. You couldn't make it HBig or H headline. It had to be H1. It had to be a legitimate HTML element. With IDs and classes, however, that's no longer the case. You can actually name them creatively, name them something that makes sense for you, and we'll demonstrate that here live in just a minute. So you kind of see something going on. You have the light gray color in the body that's styling basically the entire background of the entire page. Then we have the white area that is behind all of the content. And if I come down a little bit lower, Below this division now, we have a new division. This div is the footer. Of course, it doesn't have to be named footer again, but it's very typical to name it the footer. And you'll notice that the footer content, which is the copyright statement and these links, that will have a rollover state, the links are coming below the main container area, or this white area. They're not held up inside of it where the white content in the background and the line come underneath it. They're actually outside of it. And this is important to note when you look at layouts, when you're trying to figure out how to build them. Also, additionally and internally, there is this other division for the order box, styled a little bit different colored background, different border line. And at the moment, I've got an add to cart image, and we'll deal with this two different ways. I wanted to also cover, I should have made note in the new stuff that we're also going to cover the addition of adding PayPal button. This is a custom button image, but we're going to add the standard one and then also add this custom one to show you how both of those are done. All right, so in addition to that, of course, we have some other stylings, right? We've got what's referred to in copywriting as the pre-headline. We have the headline. We have the copy that comes underneath the headline, which is called the deck. We've got the, kind of who's the letter from information, the opening, the salutation, the opening paragraph, which I've styled with a drop cap. Again, not that you have to, but to show you kind of how that's done. We have some subheadlines, another subheadline, and then we have a bulleted list. You'll notice in this case I'm using the square bullets as opposed to the default circular filled in discs. Show you how that's done. Another headline, and then we have this order box. So we have a text link, and then down here in the bottom, again, we have this copyright information, and then we have some text links that are styled differently than the default. This is the default styling, blue underlined, and now we're going to control the link styles ourselves as well. So that's what we intend to build, and we're going to start again like we did last time, completely from scratch. So I'm going to I'm going to fire up Edit Plus, and this is the code that I've currently got live on that page that you're looking at, but we're going to start brand spanking new. So I'm going to go to File, New, and I'm going to tell Edit Plus that I want to create a new HTML page. Okay, doing so is going to cause Edit Plus to create this basic format. We talked about the basic format for or basic foundation for HTML. In my particular version of Edit Plus, this is what it's outputting currently. One of the cool things about Edit Plus, by the way, is that you can customize these. You can customize templates. You can create new templates. You can have a template for HTML 4.01, which this is, a new template for XHTML, a new template for HTML5, etc., such that when you go to create a new page, you can choose between the templates, and it gives you the raw foundation for that particular coding. So starting from the top, I told you that we would talk about doc types, and the doc type statement is right here at the very top. It's the very first line. You'll notice that it precedes the HTML tag. This is important. That's exactly the position that it needs to come into. It should be the very first thing on the page in almost all circumstances. Only a few circumstances will differ from that. When we talk about mobile sites in the future, we'll talk about the fact that there are some times that you will have something that precedes the doc type, but suffice to say, the doc type should always precede the HTML tag. What the doc type is basically is it's a statement to the browser that tells the browser what coding standard you followed when you built the web page. It's basically all it is. In addition to that, it gives an actual URL to a place where the browser can go retrieve the standard information. So if the browser goes over to this particular URL, it will find the specific information that it needs to determine how to read, understand, and style your particular web page. If you are trying to build a web page in XHTML, and we'll do that later, and probably in part 2 of this series, you would switch out the doc type to be the one that is basically telling the browser that it's XHTML, some version of XHTML as opposed to HTML 4.01. So we're going to start this exercise in HTML 4.01, and when we're completely finished with this web page, we're going to transfer or remove this doc type, replace it with the XHTML 1.0 transitional doc type, and then we're going to talk about W3C validation and how this doc type plays a part in that process. In addition to that, some ask, well, why do you have to have this here anyway if it's going to work without it? And it will work without it. The problem is, without using the doc type, a couple things happen. Number one, you can't validate your web page. The W3C requires a doc type in order for your web pages to validate. That's the first problem. So if you were trying to validate your code, it wouldn't work without it. Number two is, without the doc type declaration, which is what this is referred to, you'll also hear it referred to as the DTD, which stands for doc type declaration. Without this, the browser is going to make its own judgment call as to what it thinks you built the web page in. And as a result, you may find that your layout actually doesn't work the way you want it to. It actually might work differently than you intended, and simply adding the proper doc type might actually change the layout, something that most beginners are unaware of, but it's absolutely true. So just understand what the doc type is. It's basically, like I said, it's nothing more than a declaration that tells the browser what coding standard you use when you built the web page. Okay, so we have, again, just the simple flow. We've got the opening HTML tag. The next section down is the head area, which has the opening head at the top and the closing head at the bottom. We've got the body area again underneath it, which is the area where the content goes. And lastly, we have the closing HTML tag that tells the browser that this particular page is finished. I'm going to open up Notepad, and I have all of the copy basically that makes up the mini site that we're building. All right, so this would be similar to you either building it for yourself if you had written your sales copy in Notepad, or maybe you got copy from a client that you were going to build a simple mini site page from. This is frequently how the copy starts off. It looks very similar to this. Now I could just paste the content over between the body tag and start from there, and we will in a second, but I wanted to point one other thing out. I told you that we would talk a little bit more about HTML entities. If you look at the content, and I tried to make the font size a little bit larger than obviously the standard, so hopefully you can see this. You're going to notice a few things. Inside of the copy, I have areas surrounded with quotation marks, double quotes. So that piece is there. Headlines for sales letter are very frequently surrounded in quotation marks, as is this one. You'll see that there's another piece of text surrounded by quotation marks here. If we come down further into the copy somewhere, I know I added at least one or more, you'd find an apostrophe, some word that's has a contraction in it, like right here. So don't wait. Don't wait has the single quote or apostrophe character. And then lowest down on the page in the footer area, you'll see that temporarily I just put in kind of a fake copyright symbol. Well, all of these characters are not accurate for HTML. HTML doesn't recognize by itself double quotes. It doesn't recognize single quotes. It doesn't recognize the copyright character as I've typed it down there. etc. So one of the things that you can do prior to actually copying and pasting your content out of the notepad or out of Word, etc., and I really don't recommend that you go from Word. If you have content in a Word document, it's best to copy it out, paste it into Notepad prior to doing anything else. In addition to those, frequently in Word, you'll find problems also with the ellipsis, the ... usage right here. Frequently those will be like really tiny and tight together, and that'll tell you that it's got a messed up character. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use Notepad's find and replace feature to quickly remove these non-standard HTML characters and use the actual proper entity for them. And as you go, as you continue to build your knowledge base, you'll learn at least the basic HTML entities. I certainly don't know every HTML entity offhand, but I do know the basics. So the first, for the quotation mark symbol, we'll do right now. I've just highlighted one of the quotation marks. I'm going to Control-C to copy it. I'm going to go to Edit and then Replace. And I'm going to say, it's going to say find what? What do you want to find? Well, I'm going to Control-V to paste the double quotes. I want it to find every usage of the double quotes, and I want it to replace it with the actual HTML entity, which for a quotation mark is the ampersand symbol, and then all in lowercase QUOT semicolon. This basically says this is a quotation mark. It looks funky in the copy, but it's better for HTML. After I have this information in there, again, find all the quotation marks, replace them with the actual HTML entity. I'm going to click Replace All. Okay, so that has gone through the entire copy, and every time it found a quotation mark, it replaced it with the correct HTML entity. So that was step one. Step two, I want to do the same thing, but in this case, I want to find the single quote or the apostrophe, and I want to replace it with APOS semicolon. Again, you can easily find what the appropriate HTML entities are online, but once you know them, at least for the basic ones, you can just type them in. So ampersand APOS semicolon is the proper entity for the apostrophe. I'll replace all. That part's done. And lastly, I want to replace the copyright symbol. Now it's only in one spot, so I might as well just type it over rather than do find and replace. But I can tell you that it's ampersand, and this one's easy to remember because it's just COPY semicolon. So with that done, I'm going to save my copy, and I'm going to copy out the majority of the letter. Oops, something just weird happened. All right. Apologize. Notepad just acted strangely. All right, I'm going to copy the content of the main letter. And I'm going to paste it again between the body tags. I'm going to give it just a little bit of space so we can see that. And there's the copy, all of it. Everything except for the footer code. I didn't paste that just yet. So with that, of course, we can save this new page. We'll save it as live demo.html. We'll make the encoding a UTF-8 and we'll save it. And now, of course, if we go view this in the browser, we get this, right? Very similar to the way we started before. We have no formatting whatsoever, so it doesn't really know, doesn't know what to do with it. It's styling it, black with the sans serif font, just like we talked about from before. So we're going to start with this, and we're going to end up with this, all through the magic of CSS. All right. So we'll go back into Edit Plus, and we'll take a quick peek at things. So what we're going to do firstly is, since we know that we're going to style everything with CSS, we're going to add the ability to add styles internally or straight to this page. I'm doing this specifically for a reason. I do prefer external CSS styles, but it makes it so much easier for us just to look at how this is built if I use internal to start off with. Later in the second half of this section, we'll move the styles off of this page. We'll move it to an external style sheet and show you how that's done as well. So one of the cool things with Edit Plus is the fact that there's lots of built-in things that can speed up your process. And one of the things that is here are this row of buttons. And right here, if I hover over this one, you'll see it says Style. If I click it, you'll see that it dynamically created the basic internal style information that I need to put my styles into. So if you're typing it out, again, it's exactly what you see here. It starts with style, type equals, in quotes, text / CSS, and then the closing style. But fortunately, through Edit Plus, I don't have to remember it. I just simply click the button and it appears. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to style the body section. We're going to use just an element selector, which basically says I want to select everything that's between the body, which is all of the content. And what do I want to do? Well, again, you have an opening and a closing curly braces. The information has to come between there. And I want the content, or basically I want the background hyphen color to be this light gray. Again, you can have this to be anything you want. Now, when it comes to colors, there's a number of different ways you can build them. I'm only going to discuss using what's called the hexadecimal values. You can build colors other ways, and I guess I should just quickly make that note. You may see CSS that calls out RGB colors, red, green, blue colors. They take totally different values, and it's not something that I use. I couldn't teach it to you if I mean, I understand it, but I couldn't teach it to you if I wanted to because I don't use them. I use exactly what I'm showing you here. So in hexadecimal colors for HTML, they're made up of 6 characters maximum. I say maximum because you will see here as we go that it is possible to build colors with 3 values, and I'll show you when that's appropriate. But in this case, I know that E8, E8, E8 is a nice pleasant light gray, and that's where we're going to start. So I'm going to just save the page again. Very little will have changed, and it'll be probably hard to see, but you will notice that we now have a light gray colored background. All right, so jumping back to Edit Plus, we're going to build this out. I think probably the way that this is going to be most productive, rather than me typing all of this live, is to kind of just bring it over from the other live example block by block and just kind of show you how it's built. So that's, I think, what I'm going to do. So if I come over to the live, the finished page, rather, the code that I've coded the other day, I'm going to just paste these over one at a time, and we'll just talk about them. You can see already that the very first statement in this one was the same that we just created, the background color styled with the same color. So I'm going to just replace this with this, and I'll save it again. Now notice a couple of things. Let me give some space here. We're still using the body selector just like before. We still have an opening curly bracket there. We still have a closing curly bracket here, so it's the same thing. But now we have multiple declarations, each one of these lines being a new declaration. You can have as few as one or as many as you'd like declarations attached to the same selector. So all this is saying is, in addition to causing the background to be a light gray, which is what we did in the last step, here's also what I want you to do. I also want you to make all of the text that you find in the, between the body tags, I want you to make it Tahoma. That's a font type. Now, the rest of this is what's referred to as a fallback. So if the viewer of our web page has the Tahoma font loaded on their computer, it will show them all of our text in Tahoma. However, when using fonts like this, there's a problem. The problem is it requires that the user, the viewer of our web page, has this particular font on their computer. So what these question marks, these commas, separate this new font family here. It says try to use Tahoma. If the user doesn't have Tahoma on their machine, then try to use Arial. If they don't have Arial on their machine, try to use Helvetica. And if they really don't have Helvetica on their machine, then use any sans serif font. And you'll see sans serif is all in lowercase, and it's the two words are separated with a hyphen. At the end of each declaration again comes the semicolon. It says this particular declaration is finished. This is important to note, and I'll show you what happens when you break things here in just a second. So again, just go with the understanding of font family. It's trying to call out what type of fonts are going to be displayed to the user, and the reason that there's multiples is because the user may or may not have what you're trying to use on your web pages. We'll get more into Google Web Fonts and how they improve things from this traditional usage in the future in the Beyond series that'll come after this. So that's the hows and whys. I should also point out one other thing. If you try to use a font that has more than one word in it, like Century Gothic, there's two words, this is how it's built. So if I wanted to use Century Gothic as part of this, I would put in quotation marks, Century space Gothic, quotation mark, comma, space. This would allow it now to use Tahoma if they don't have Tahoma, to use Arial if they don't have Arial, to use Century Gothic. In order to use a font that has more than one word in it, you need to make sure that there's the space between each word, and you need to make sure that the font family or the font type is quoted. This throws off some people, especially those that are strong in English, because in English typically the comma comes before the quotation mark. So proper English would be this. However, this is not proper for CSS. So just pay a note or attention to, you need the quotation marks around the font family and the comma to come after it. Same thing with Times New Roman. There's now 3. So Times New Roman works the exact same way. Now there happens to be 3 words as part of the font name, not just 2. So just pay attention to that. If you ever try to use a font that has more than one name in it, you need to quote the font name. And there's no limit to how many of these you could go. Just because I've used 3 real and then the sans serif fallback, you don't have to do that. You could use 2, you could use 1, you could use 5. It's really up to you. Font size. We're setting the font size to a particular size, in this case 16 pixels in height. We're setting the font color. I know this doesn't say font before it, but that's what this is. The color statement is attacking, is the color of the text. In this case, it is 3 zeros. Now, just a minute ago, I told you that hexadecimal code, or colors, are 6 characters max in length, and that is true. So the question is, well, why is this one only 3? The answer here is if, and only if, the HTML color is made up of the entire same character for all 6 characters. So this would be the same color. This is black. 6 zeros is black. But since it is the same across all 6 characters, you can shorten it to simply 3. It's up to you. There's not a right or a wrong way. It just makes things a little bit faster if you know that you're going to go that route. For instance, all threes, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, all threes is a very dark gray, near black but not black. So what I'm saying to you is you can style the same with just threes. And this isn't just for numerics. Same thing with white. There's 6 Fs in a row, which is pure white. This can also be styled with just FFF. Again, this only works if the HTML hexadecimal color is the same across same value across all 6. I should also point out lowercase and uppercase, they don't matter. So this is the exact same thing as this. It's entirely up to you what you want to use. So I'm going to put this back to the 3 zeros, which is black. Also now you see that it says I want to text align left. So I don't want the content centered. I want my sales page, all of the content, unless told otherwise, I want it to be aligned to the left. Okay. Now, one other thing to point out before we go look at this and then keep going on is just this. You might be confused as to say, well, wait a minute. You've already seen the sales page. I know that some of the fonts are not Tahoma. I know that some of the font sizes are much bigger than 16 pixels, and I know that some of the text color is certainly not black. It's, you know, a dark red. And some of it's not aligned left, it's centered. Well, that's one of the cool things with CSS is that we can select individual areas and style them differently. This comes basically now to the concept of cascading. We talked about cascading style sheets, or at least the definition in the last, but we really didn't define it all that well. When you think of a cascade, something that's falling, what happens is this. Unless I tell it otherwise, even though I'm only, I'm basically saying everything between the body tag, which is all of the content currently, and will be all of the content when we're finished. What should it do? It should make it all Tahoma, if possible. It should make everything 16 pixels. It should make all the text black, and it should align everything to the left. It falls down basically on everything that happens between the body tag. The only exception then is if it finds more specific code later on. So it'll continue to fall down upon all of our content until it finds basically a conflict, until it finds, well, wait a minute, now they're saying I want to style this area differently, and you'll see how that's built. If you don't decide to style it differently, then the cascade effect will basically allow it to fall over anything that you're not specifically styling, I guess is maybe the best way to put it, and I'm hoping that makes sense. So all we've done now is we've added a little bit of internal CSS. We've styled the background color. We've set the font types, sizes, colors, and aligned to left. It's still not going to be pretty, but you will see that now we've got a different font type. Since my machine does have Tahoma on it, we're looking at Tahoma, and we're now looking at it in 16 pixels. Okay, that's really the only change that's happened to this point. Next, we'll just keep grabbing CSS and start building it. Now we've got this new thing here that says main container, and it's preceded by the number sign or the pound sign or the hashtag, whichever way you want to refer to it as. It's the same character. What is this? This is our first div, our first division. We're going to talk about divisions with, or selectors even, that have either an ID or a class. Whenever you see, a word like this preceded by the number or pound symbol, you can be assured that it is what's referred to as the ID. This is a div ID. Lower down on the page, we will find something that has a period. In this case, we have a paragraph, and then the word special, and the word special has a period before it. This is a class. So this is a paragraph with a class of special. You know it's a class because of the period, whereas higher up in the code that we just looked at, we've got 3 div IDs: main container, order box, and footer. Again, I know that they're IDs because of the number or pound sign. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to break our code basically into 3 div areas, and that's basically, this is basically how that's done. So we have an area that we want to style differently, the main container, and I'll grab this. Actually, I'll just grab all 3 of these. We'll take a look at all 3 of these. I'll bring all 3 of those across. Again, I'm just adding them in between the style tags on our running or live page. Okay, I've saved it, but what you're going to notice is nothing's changed. If we go look at it live, even though we've got new CSS code, you'll see that nothing has changed whatsoever. And the reason that is that even though we have CSS styling up here in the top, we haven't actually, it doesn't know how to select it. We haven't added any HTML to our actual content whatsoever. So here's what I mean by that. The main container, the white area with the dark background, we want to be everything except for that footer area that has the copyright statement and the text links. So what we need to do is we need to tell our content then, or force our content to be between those divs. So this is how this works. Again, it's an angle bracket div. In this case, rather than just making it, let me do that first. This is a standard div element, opening div and the closing div. And you can use this just like this. You don't always have to have an ID or a class listed in the opening div, but frequently you will. So this works by itself. Of course, there's no content between it at the moment, but we're going to add it with an ID that is exact to right here. It has to match whatever you are using. And I mentioned earlier at the very beginning that these are just made up names in these instances. So while I'm using main container, you don't have to use that. If you wanted this to be content, that would work perfectly well, so long as down here you identify the ID to equal content. Whatever you're using up here needs to match perfectly down in your HTML structure. So I'll go ahead and put that back to main container. And we'll go ahead and just copy this bit of text, which is specific to the ID, and we're going to paste it in the opening div tag down here. Let me bring this up a bit. I'm going to space over, I'm going to type in lowercase ID equals, and then in quotation marks, I'm going to put main container. Note in Edit Plus, all this text became pink. It's basically telling you, it's giving you indications that you're not finished yet. Without that closing quotation mark, it's basically telling you things are broken. As soon as I type the end quotation mark, you see that everything goes back to the way it's supposed to be. And I guess I should make note, in Edit Plus, one of the cool things is all of the text that remains black is the text that you're actually going to see, your viewer is going to see. You'll notice that the HTML entities, here these and quotes, that they're light green, basically letting you know that they're not going to actually see the and quote. They're going to see the quotation mark, but they're not actually going to see this bit of text. That's what Edit Plus is basically telling you as you build your page. Okay, so we've got an opening div underneath the body tag that says, hey, we're now going to create this new division, this new area of our site with an ID of main container. Note that down here we do not use the number sign. The number sign is not used in the HTML. It's only used up in the actual CSS area. The way that it knows whether the number sign or the period should be used is this right here, the ID. Again, ID refers to the pound sign, and if this was a class, then this would have to be period main container. We'll get into the hows and whys of the two in just a minute. So next, the only other thing I want to point out before we move this closing div tag to the very bottom is the next thing. We're going to talk a little bit about HTML comments, HTML comment code. You can leave yourself comments in your code that will not be shown to the world. They won't be shown to your live visitors, unless of course they're looking at your source code. But if they're looking at your regular web page, they won't ever see it. But it's really good to leave yourself comments so that you can keep yourself on track and remember what exactly that you're doing. It'll just make your life easier later on. So I can type it fully out, and I guess I should probably do that once, and then I can show you that in Edit Plus they've got a handy button that'll create it for you. So here's what HTML comment code, the format that it looks like. There's the opening angle bracket or the less than sign. There's the exclamation point, 2 hyphens, and then a space. Now you'll notice what happened. Right at the moment, all of this other text turned green again, which basically means, uh-oh, you've just done something, you've just started something, and you're not finished. So just pay attention to that. Again, it's the angle bracket. Let me space so you can kind of see this by itself. The angle bracket, the exclamation point, 2 hyphens, and then this is where you get to leave whatever comment you want to leave to yourself. In this case, I'm going to type the word end and then the main container div. I'm going to space, I'm going to do 2 hyphens, and then the closing angle bracket. And as soon as I've done that, you'll notice that all of the text goes back to black again because it knows that I've successfully closed basically that HTML comment. Without that closing area right here, it will cause problems with your page. And this is one of the things that frequently frustrates those that are newer with HTML, because the simplest of things, you know, leaving off just that one hyphen, you see how it went back to all green. Putting it back now makes it proper. So what this is, what this HTML comment code is now, it's a reminder to me that this particular ending div tag, I used it to end the main container division, the main container div. If I keep them together, it gives me a really good roadmap in order to make sure that I've closed everything that I've opened. In HTML, it is absolutely imperative that if you've opened a tag, like this opens the div tag, that we close it, and we close it in the appropriate place. Because each closing div looks identically the same, it just has /div, it can become confusing as to, okay, well, which div did I close? Because we're going to create several divs as part of even this basic page. And in a complex page, you may have literally, dozens of divs running on a page. So what we're going to do is we're going to highlight this entire section from the closing div all the way to the HTML comment code, and I'm going to Control X to cut it. I'm going to come to the bottom of the content, and I'm going to Control V to paste it back in. This now is my reminder that this particular div closes the main container div. That's all that I'm basically using it for, and I'm hoping that makes some sense. You'll see how this builds as we go along. Now, if we go look at the CSS now, what are we telling it to do? Well, we're telling the main container everything between that new div ID to be 750 pixels in width, which is just an arbitrary value that looks fine. You don't have to use it. You want to go 800, you can go 800. If you want to go narrower, you can go narrower. I just chose it because I happen to like it for sales pages. We're also saying to have margin, or basically some space at the top. And actually, we need to discuss margins and paddings and how they're called out here in just a minute. This is definitely another new thing. We'll get back to this. We're saying that in this area, we don't want that light gray color. We want a background of white, the 3 Fs. We'll discuss padding here in a second, and we'll also the border is pretty easy. With the border, we have 3 different values attached to border. We're firstly telling the border line itself to be really thin, 1 pixel in width. We're telling it to be solid, a solid line. We can use solid. You can see down here for the order box we're using dashed. You can also use dotted, basically different types of lines. We're using a 1 pixel thick solid border line in this specific color. That particular color is a dark gray, or medium dark gray at least. So I'm going to save this. We'll go look at the output. It's still going to be ugly, but it's getting prettier. So just by that simple, creating that simple div ID of main container, telling it to have a white background, telling it to have a border line, and then using some margin and padding, we now have this. Rather than this left aligned content or this left aligned page, we've got a page that's centered and it's 750 pixels wide. I wanted to do that and go back to margin and padding because they can be kind of confusing. The margin is happening outside of this box area. So this distance between the top line and the browser window should be roughly 30 pixels of margin on the top. On the right-hand side, it's set to auto, meaning figure out what the width of the browser window is and set the same value on the right-hand side as you do on the left, which effectively centers the page. And then on the bottom, there's also a margin setting that says how much space should happen between this area and the bottom part of the window. Padding, on the other hand, is what's happening internally. It's this white spacing that's showing up between the text and this border line. So let's just play with that for just a second, and then we'll set it back to where we were. If for whatever reason I wanted my page to start right at the very top, and there are designs that do this, I could change this top value. What I want to show you about margin and padding is that you can attack them individually, or you can attack them globally. And here's what this means. And remember that it starts from the top and it works itself around clockwise. So it's the top, the right, the bottom, and then the left. So what this is saying is above this division, I want 30 pixels of space on the top. The next is to the right. In this case, I want to use auto. I want it to be centered. Okay, what do I want on the bottom? Again, top, right, bottom, left. On the bottom, I want 20 pixels of space below the white area to the bottom of the window. Okay, what do you want on the left? I want the left and the right to be auto so that the page is centered. So again, it starts from the top, the right, the bottom, and the left. Now over here for the padding, you'll notice that I only have one value. If you only use one value, it will assign it to all 4. So you can have basically just use one 20 pixel value and it will assign a padding of 20 pixels, top, right, bottom, and left. There are other ways to build this, but that's about all I'm going to get into right at the moment. Yeah, Jerry.
Just want to point out that you don't use commas between these items like you do with font family.
True. Yeah, you'll notice over here when you're adding basically multiple values to one property, in this case the property being margin, and multiple values. This is what's referred to as CSS shorthand, by the way. There's no commas between. There's simply a space between each one of these values. Thanks, Jerry, for mentioning that. I will point out one other thing. It is possible to create margin and or padding and some other things, typically margin and padding, with either one value. Like I said, one value will assign it to all four, top, right, bottom, left. It's also possible to do it with two. It's also possible to do it with three. The three gets really, really confusing. I won't be talking about three. I'll be talking about either 1, 2, or 4. And here's what I mean by 2. Let's say, for example, I wanted to put in padding 20 pixels, 10 pixels. If I did this now, what it would do is it would take the first value, it would assign it to the top and bottom. It would take the second value and assign it to the left and to the right. So if you have consistent values, top and bottom and left and right, then you can just use two values. Again, the first would go top and bottom, the second would go left and right. It's probably best when you're just starting off and new that you decide to do it just either with 1 or 4. You'll build as you go. But you know that if you do 1, it's going to use the value across all 4, which makes it really easy to understand. And if you decide to use 4 values, then you understand that it starts from the top and it works clockwise. Top, right, bottom, and left. You'll notice that I used all 4 in this case because the top and bottom values are different. If I were using 30 pixels top, 30 pixels bottom, I could have just used 30 pixels, 30px auto, and that would have been the same. So with that, let's take a look at kind of how this works. So margin, like I said, the first value is the top. If I change this now to 100 pixels, and we go take a look, and maybe I make the padding, I don't know, 40, you'll see a strong change just happens between here. This page is going to get pushed way down, and we're going to have way more white space. So we have 100 pixels now of spacing here at the top, and we've got much more white space between the text and this box. One of the things to note, though, you remember that we set the div for main container, we set it to 750 pixels in width. But here's what you need to know about padding. In most browsers are going to add the padding to whatever you've defined. So I'm going to bring up a free add-on for Firefox called Measure It. You'll see that it kind of grays out the page and it gives me this this crosshair. If I put this on this line over here and I click and hold and I drag, you're going to see that we get a ruler. If I bring it over to here, you'll see that this width area, it says, is 833 pixels, 832 now in width. And I know that it's not pixel perfect, but if we had 750 pixels inside and then we just added now 40 pixels of margin to both sides, you got 750, right, initially, plus 40 plus 40, so 750 plus 80 is equaling 830 pixels in width. Because we have a 1 pixel wide border on both sides, it's 832 pixels is our real width. So just pay attention to that fact. If you're really trying to end up with a specific width, say you have a header image that is exactly 750 pixels, when you go to create your div, make sure that you take into account your padding. You might have to have, a 700 pixel wide area with a 25 pixel wide padding on both sides to come up to 750. Just make note of that. I'll measure it off, and we'll go back and take a look. So again, margin is happening outside of the div area. Padding is happening on the inside of the div area, but it is also causing the div area to grow larger than the value that we set in the CSS because of the padding. Okay? I'm hoping that was understandable. So we'll put the padding back to 20 where I had it, and we'll put the margin. Actually, before we put margin back to 30, let's just get rid of it altogether. Just show you something here. Whenever you're defining a 0 value, you don't have to put the px next to it or any other value should you not want to. It's really better practice to have no value next to it. You will see code that says 0 px. The px becomes redundant because 0 anything is simply 0. So 0 px will work. 0 will work just fine by itself, and it is what I prefer. So I'm going to set margin to 0 on the top and just quickly show you that basically now we have no space on the top. The page moves nicely to the top, or does it? We still have some spacing up here. And the question then becomes, well, wait a minute, where's this coming from? Why do we have some spacing up here that we didn't state, right? That division is supposed to be margin of 0. It's coming because, again, we talked about in the last practice, in the last HTML course, or session rather, we talked about that there was browser default styles. And by default, the browser is adding some amount of margin and padding to our document, something that basically it's trying to control us rather than us allowing the ability to control it. So what can be done is you can set margins in the body to 0 and remove it from there, or you can use what's referred to as the universal selector. And I'll just demonstrate the universal selector right now. The universal selector is the asterisk, and if you type the asterisk and then the opening and closing curly brackets, what this is saying is universally do this. I'm not trying to attack an HTML element. I'm not looking for div IDs and containers. I just want you to do this on everything. And what I can do is set margin, after I go back to lowercase, margin to 0. So if I set margins to 0 globally across everything, unless of course it's told to do something else later on, we're now going to have an updated page that should go to the very top. And you see that we have now basically overridden the default browser style sheet as it pertains to margins. Okay, you can also do the same thing for paddings because the browser is definitely by default it's setting particular margins and paddings to your code, and frequently it's advantageous to control both. So let me do this real quick. I'll just set margins and paddings to 0 with the universal selector. Again, all I've typed is just the asterisk, and everything else is exactly formed the way that we would form a CSS rule. Sorry, the entire thing here is called the CSS rule. Escape my brain for just a second. Alrighty, so we've gotten rid of the default margin and padding. I'm going to put the 30 pixels back on top of the main container. We'll view it just one more time, and then we're going to speed this thing up and get off to the races. Okay, so we've got a little space now above our content. We do have a gray background, a white background behind our content. We've got some nice attractive space between the content and this box. and then a nice line basically wrapped around it. All right. So now what we need to do is we need to quickly look at the original page, and we need to figure out some of what we want to do. Excuse me. Let me go back to the original page here. So this is the way that we want it to turn out. Well, down here lower, these are pretty easy, right? These are paragraphs. That's pretty easy to figure out. This I'm going to call use as the heading 1 and H1. It's the biggest and boldest content on our page. Not that you have to do that for an H1, but that makes sense. This area here, you can see I want it to be a particular size, and I want it to be centered, as centered with the H1 as well. The pre-headline, I want basically left aligned, which is, again, the default that we've set for all content in the body tag, unless we tell it to do differently. But I want it to be a bigger font than the standard. We've got this drop cap, as it's referred to, this big red W, and you can tell that this is in a serif font, a different font type altogether. And we've got these sub-headlines, which we can cause to be H2s or H3s. We've got an unordered list, a bulleted list. We've got this order box area. And then again, underneath all of this content, we've got the footer area. So let's build the footer area next, and then we'll start styling all the contents on the page as rapidly as possible. So underneath now, this content, we want that copyright information and those text links. So what we have to do is make sure that our new div comes beneath the main container div, which again is one of the reasons we use this HTML comment code. So I'm going to create a new div down here, div ID equals, in quotes, footer. I'm going to close the div tag, and then I'm going to use an HTML comment code to, again, note that that closes that particular footer div. Again, I said in Edit Plus, you have built-in things. So if I click the comment, you'll see that it populates everything except for what I'm going to type between it, which just speeds the process up. So that ends the footer division. I'll space this down a little bit, and now we'll put our footer content right here. The footer content, again, if going back to our text document, I separated out as right here. Oops. So it's got the copyright statement, and then it has some text links. That's what's going to happen at the very end. Of course, they're not links just yet. They're just text. We have copyright 2012 yourdomain.com, and then we have the ability to add as many text links as we want. When we go look at this now, we will see that it worked properly, and the reason that it worked properly is because we've already added the footer CSS from the previous. So I've told the footer area, that footer division, to be the same width as the main container. In this case, I don't want any margin or any space above the new division. I want it centered again, so I'm using auto on the right and auto on the left. And over here, again, remember top, right, bottom, left. The bottom, I'm saying to add 40 pixels of space beneath the footer, and you'll see why here in a minute. I'm also deciding to change the color, the font color. No longer do I want the font color to be black. I want it to be this dark gray. And again, you can make it anything you want. The text alignment in this area, no longer do I want it to be left aligned. I want it to be text-align centered. And I don't want the font size to be 16 pixels. Again, it would naturally be 16 pixels. It would be black. It would be left aligned if I didn't tell it to be something different because of the cascading effect. So we're going to make it a little bit smaller. We'll go look at the page, refresh, and now you see that we have just the raw text here. But you'll also notice that it's in the proper place. It's not inside of the container area, it's beneath it. And the reason that is because we've created this new division and we've styled it in such a way as to appear this way. But the reason it shows up here and not inside of the white area is because we closed off this other division and we said, look, we're done with this division. We're no longer do we need a white background with this this dark borderline. It now allows it to sit basically over the body area. Hoping that makes sense. If we go back to the code now, we have basically still almost no styling whatsoever to the content at all. We've only styled basically the main container area, the footer area. Lastly, we'll go style the final div, and then we'll go style all the content. The final div we've set aside to show the order box. So there's this bit of text here that says, you know, don't wait, act now and save. And then this content right here, everything from yes, Joe, down to the placeholder for the actual live buy button is in this area. So we want this area to be now a unique division that we can control separately from everything else. And that's basically what you can think of as the reason why divs are used. So in this case, we're using another div ID of order box, and I will come down here and basically just do this. I'm going to type the opening div with an ID equals in quotation marks of order box. We'll type the closing div. We'll add an HTML comment that says this is the ending div for the order box div. Okay. Then I'm going to highlight the closing div in the comment. I'm going to Control X to cut it. I need to make sure that the closing div happens after the area or the text basically that we're trying to control. So we're trying to control this now, this text, differently than everything else. And the way that we're doing that is by wrapping that content in this new div, the div of order box. Okay, so I'll save the page, but before we go look at it, let's go take a look at what we're telling the order box to do. We no longer want it to be 750 pixels in width like the main container and footer. We want it to be something less wide, in this case 500 pixels. We're also calling out a new background color. Again, remember that background color affects the background color behind something, and the word color, like this, actually controls the color of the text. Okay, so background color in this case, I'm using a particular color that's kind of like a light yellow. We want a border on it, but we want the border different than the main container border. We want the border to be 4 pixels, so thicker. Instead of solid, we want it dashed, kind of looks like a series of hyphens. And then we want the color, in this case, to be a dark red, which CC and then 4 zeros is kind of this deep red that's used very frequently with many sites. The padding inside of the box now, we want 15 pixels of padding, whereas before we were using 20 for the main container, which, as you know, is going to grow the box. So the left-hand side and the right-hand side both have 15 pixels of padding. So the actual full width of this box is not going to be 500. It's going to be 500 plus the 15 pixels of padding on the left plus the 15 pixels of padding on the right for a total of 530, just pointing that out. And then the margin or the spacing that we're trying to cause above and below the box is set to 0. Don't add any extra spacing. And to center the box on the page with the use of auto. So again, if you only use 2 values, the first value is top and bottom, the second value is right and left. Okay, so with that in place, we can go look at the live page, and now we get this. So we've got now a new area. Obviously it's that yellow color. It has the border exactly as defined. It is centered on the page. It doesn't look all that pretty, but you get the idea. We're kind of just building this thing, you know, step by step. Going back to Edit Plus, we're going to need to speed this entire process up. So I'm just going to start copying HTML blocks from here and pasting it over to the other and then explaining them. Actually, we'll just go ahead and copy over all of the remaining CSS first. Again, this will not have changed anything on the page to this point, because even though we've added new CSS, we haven't allowed it to connect it basically to, you know, well, what is supposed to be styled in a particular way. The two have to mate. You know, you can't have just call out div ID equals main container here and have no main container CSS. Conversely, you can't have main container CSS and not ever tell it which area is the main container, because it doesn't know how to select a particular area if you don't. So with that, I'm going to start at the top of the page. We'll go back to the HTML of the completed page. And I think we'll grab everything down to dear friend firstly. And we'll just build this up in segments. So instead of the default, I'm going to paste the finished HTML and we'll just describe it. So the first thing you'll notice is that piece of text at the very top of the page, the pre-headline. I've decided to style it as an H3 heading, which is why that the entire bit of text is wrapped in the H3 heading. You'll also notice that I'm using the B tag for bold to cause the word attention to be bolded. You know I'm using it just to bold the word attention and nothing else, because you see the closing tag right behind it. If I move the B tag somewhere else, it would bold whatever was between the opening and closing bold tags. Okay, so that's the first thing to understand, is that very first bit of text is being styled as an H3 heading. Next, the actual main headline we are styling as an H1. You see the opening and closing H1 tags here. You also notice that we've got a line break here and then again here. This is just controlling or helping me control the look and feel of the headline on the page, which, just as an aside, is crucial for sales pages. I'll get rid of that for the moment. If I just put the raw text here without those line breaks, you'll see the difference in how it looks. Next is I'm using a paragraph to style the next line of content, which is again called the deck copy in copywriting terms. But you'll notice something new here. Paragraph with a class of deck copy. Again, with the understanding that classes equal periods, basically. So you're looking for period deck copy up in the CSS to figure out what I'm asking it to do. This is our first class. So our first class selector. So what I'm going to do, I guess, is take just a second to define the difference between IDs and classes and why you want to choose one over another sometimes. The reality is that IDs can only be used once on a page. So I can't style one area to be div ID equals main container and then reuse it and say another, you know, div ID equals main container sometime lower down in the code. That's not allowed. So that's the first thing to understand, is if you use an ID, you can only use it once on a page. Because the main container only happens once, it makes sense to use an ID. Same thing with the footer. We don't have multiple footers. We have one footer area, so the footer being an ID makes sense too. But what about this? Maybe you want to style one paragraph differently than the other, but you want to use it multiple times throughout your text. Well, if that's the case, then using the class makes more sense, because classes do allow you to reuse them as many times as you'd like inside the same page. So I could call out, this, if I wanted to, could become a new paragraph of class equals deck copy if I wanted to. And immediately, this bit of text, everything that happens between this new paragraph, would be styled the same way as this, etc. And that's basically the primary reason between IDs and classes. That's at least the first level. The second level is more complex, but I guess I should make mention that IDs in CSS, they're given more weight or more import than classes. So if you ever have anything that conflicts, any conflicting CSS code, just know that it will override the class callout and it will use the ID callout. It assumes that your ID CSS styling is more important than any other CSS styling on your page. And so if you ever run into an issue where you're trying to debug a page, something's not working properly, you look and you see that you look up in the CSS and you see class .deck copy, and you see, man, it says it's doing exactly what I want it to do, but it's just not doing it. You might want to look and see if there's any conflicting CSS that might be in your code, especially if it uses an ID, because it might be deciding to use that styling for it instead. So really just think of it, if you're newer to this whole thing, just think of the fact that IDs you can only use once on a web page, and classes you can use multiple times. So again, we're styling this paragraph differently than standard paragraphs, and the way that we're doing that is by assigning it this new class of deck copy. Lower, we've got a new paragraph, just standard, nothing special about it. There's the opening and the closing. The only difference in this whole area is that we're using a line break to force the date information to be on the next line. And then we've got just a standard paragraph that starts the dear friend. All right, so actually underneath this, these are all just standard paragraphs as well, everything down to the subheadline. So I might as well just copy those over. I take that back. There is something unique in the drop cap. That's okay. We're already here. We might as well do it. We'll talk about spans here in just a minute. For the moment, though, I'm going to show you the page live, and then we'll go basically define the CSS that's controlling them. You'll start seeing that, hey, it's starting to look a little bit more like the finished raw product. Note, though, that the big bold headline, it is, big and bold. It does have the right color. Just doesn't look all that attractive as opposed to the original. You'll see there's some more spacing. In addition to that, though, look at the way that the line breaks. This is a big and bold headline. It starts on the next line, and then your sales letter. In our new version, or our live version, sales letter is on its own line. It is still on the top, etc. And that's where those line breaks were used. Those line breaks were used up inside the headline to cause it, let's see, there and there, to be able to force the word "it's" to a new line, and then also the word "your" to a new line. And that's just an appropriate usage, basically, of the line break, the ability to allow you to control the layout of that area just a little bit better. So it's one of those things that you kind of have to play around with. You have to make the page live and then go back and mess with it, because you won't know probably until you make it live where it makes most sense to kind of break some things. So let's see, going back to Edit Plus, let's discuss the elements that we've just added. So we've added an H3 heading, an H1 heading. We have a paragraph of with a class of deck copy, and we'll stop there. We'll get to the span in just a minute. We don't really need to define the B. You know that's bolding of something. But coming up here, if we look at the H3, first off, that's that pre-headline, you'll see that we are changing the font size. No longer do we want the default 16 pixels that we set in the body. We want it to be a little bit larger. Here's something else to note. It might seem weird. We're setting the font weight to normal. Now, headings by default, again, going back to the understanding that there's a browser style sheet. By default, the browsers set all headings, H1 through H6, it causes them to be bold. Sometimes this is exactly what you want. Sometimes, however, it's not. So if you ever decide to use a heading, but you don't necessarily want it to be bold, just know that you can override the font weight of with a value of bold. You can use the word normal, and it will override the browser style sheet and cause it to display it. Normally, it'll be 18 pixels because that's what we're asking it to be. It will have a particular margin to the top of 5 pixels. Here's a new thing. Before, when we were calling out margin up here, we were just using the word margin. And now you see down here it says margin top. If you want to control margins individually, because you know that there's only one value, you can use margin hyphen. Margin hyphen top will only assign this value to the top margin. You can also do the same for margin hyphen bottom, margin hyphen left, margin hyphen right. So just note that. It's typically only going to get used if you're just using one particular value. It really makes no sense to type margin top on one line and then start typing, margin, I can't type right now, margin bottom. There we go. If I were to type margin bottom here and then give it a value and then try to go margin left, it really makes no sense to do that. You might as well just combine it all into one margin statement, simply just using margin without the hyphen. But if you're just attacking the top or the left or the bottom or the right, just know that you can also do this. So I'm adding 5 pixels of extra space, basically margin above the H3 heading text, and I'm making it 18 pixels, and I'm turning off the normal bold, and I'm causing it to be just the standard font weight through the use of normal. If we go live and look at it, you'll notice that that is the reason then I was able to bold the word attention, was because I turned off the bolding for the rest of it. This is all in H3. If I didn't add font weight normal, if we got rid of this, you'd see that the entire thing was bold. And this brings up our first understanding of CSS comments, and I'll show you how that's typed and how it's used. In CSS, comments are done a little bit differently than HTML comments. In CSS, you have a /, the asterisk, and that starts a CSS comment. That's it, just a / and an asterisk. You'll see, again, Edit Plus is showing me this content below it now in green, meaning that it's going to ignore it because of that simple character that I just typed, these 2 simple characters. Your comment comes between it, and then you just reverse the pattern, asterisks, /. So it starts with a / asterisk next, it ends with an asterisk, and then / last. This is a CSS comment. You can see that when properly closed, all of the text went to, back to the proper color through Edit Plus. This again is similar to HTML comments. It doesn't do anything other than gives you the ability to leave yourself some notes. That said, there is one additional usage of CSS comments that specifically, if you're new, you'll find extremely handy. So what you can do is you can use comments to temporarily test elements of your CSS. So by that I mean this. We said that H3 heading, excuse me, the text, getting froggy. Let me take a quick drink. Apologize. All right, the H3 heading by default would be bold. We're overriding it, causing font weight to be normal. But let's just say we want to test it live without actually removing it. We just want to test. What you can do is wrap individual declarations in a CSS comment. So I really don't have any content between it. Rather, now the content between it is the actual CSS declaration. But you can see that it made it in green. And because it was opened and closed, it's not affecting anything else. It's just basically temporarily causing this bit of CSS to be ignored is really what's happening. So if I Control S and save that and we go look at it live, we'll see that this heading text is going to be entirely bold. Again, because that is the default set up by the browser. So that's basically what I'm overwriting with that little bit of CSS, font weight equals normal. Also note something else, that during your testing you might want to basically turn off a rule altogether. You can do the same thing, not just for individual declarations, you can do the same thing for an entire rule. So I put the /* before the selector, and I put the closing, the reverse of it, the */ after the end curly bracket, and you'll see that now it's turned off basically the entire CSS rule. So now when we get rid of it and go look at the page, not only will it not be bold because it's no longer, well, it's still being called as an H3 in the HTML, so it's still going to be bold, but it's not going to be this size. You can see that it changed. It's actually the default browser size for whatever the browser decided to make an H3 is being controlled rather than our custom CSS styling. Anyway, that's just a way that you can use CSS commenting to basically test certain elements of your page. Yeah, Jerry.
Just remember, you can't put comments inside of comments. It acts really bizarre, so don't try that.
Okay, so what Jerry's saying is get the idea.
Right, so if you had commented out font weight normal and then you commented out the whole H3, it could act a little off.
Okay.
So.
But just demonstrated live, you'll see that Edit Plus is giving you some understanding that there's a problem, because what it does is it looks for that first closing comment to close it. So it's ignoring the second open, but it's saying, hey, this is closed, and now it's doing, I don't know what to do with this. So yeah, something to pay attention to. But that's what CSS comments are. And again, typically they're left as a note to you, the web page or website developer, such that you can remember certain things for future development or redevelopment of a web page. But they also have a secondary role in actually doing some amount of debugging, as I've just demonstrated to you. So I hope that makes sense. Coming back down again, so right now we've discussed the H3 heading. We've also styled the headline with an H1. So again, in this case, we've changed the font family. No longer do we want Tahoma, but we want Impact. Impact is a really nice font for headlines. It's used very much. And so we've gotten rid of Tahoma and replaced it with Impact. You can see that the font size is, of course, way bigger. We're using text align to center the text on the page. So it's overriding the body's CSS, the desire to left align it. We're changing the color, no longer to use the CSS called out for body for black, but to be the dark red. And again, we're using font weight of normal. Now this might seem weird. You think, well, why would you use font weight of normal once you use a bold headline? And I'm only pointing this out in case you ever do decide to use Impact. Impact by itself, this particular font, is extremely bolded. And so temporarily, I'm going to turn off this last CSS declaration, as we just discussed, using a comment, which will allow the font weight to be bold. And if we go look at it, you're going to see that it's really ugly. You're going to see that it starts to plug up, and almost no spacing in these inner areas. It just looks wrong. And the reason it looks wrong is that it's already an incredibly bolded font, and the browser then is trying to basically bold an already incredibly bolded font, and it just looks wrong. So if you ever run into an area where, especially with headings, that you know that the browser's causing them to be bold, if something just kind of looks wrong, you might want to try switching it back to font weight normal just to see if that cleans things up. It certainly does for Impact. Impact, in my opinion, looks really, really good if it's used in its normal state, and it looks really, really bad if it's bolded. So just an additional aside there. So that's what's happening with the H1. That's what's happening with the H3. Let's see, what else did we do? We did a paragraph with a class of deck copy. Okay, so here is a new bit of CSS and a new way to attack it too. You see that we have the word deck copy here, and you'll see that deck copy is preceded by the period, so you know that, again, it's the class of deck copy. But what gives with the whole P tight to it, right? And that's this. There are so many different types of CSS selectors, it'll make your head spin. And I don't want to get in, or I don't want to get into just crazy selectors because it can get extremely complex. But I do want to talk about some of the more common ones. You're likely to see this very commonly, and I want you to understand it. What this basically means is, in order for this rule to be applied, and this rule is text align centered with a font size of 18 pixels. In order for this rule to get applied, it is only looking for paragraphs with a specific class of deck copy. So here's what I'm trying to say. If lower down in the HTML it finds a paragraph with a class of deck copy, it is going to cause the paragraph to be centered, and it's going to cause the text to be 18 pixels, larger than the default 16, okay? Because the paragraph and the class of deck copy are tight together, there are no spaces, this will happen. If I space after the paragraph, now it says anything that has a class of deck copy which is also inside of a paragraph to do this. Now that might seem like the same thing, but it's not. And I guess I'll have to demonstrate that live in a second. Let's put it back to the way it was and show you what I mean by this. So it's a paragraph with a class of deck copy. If we come down and look at the code, we'll see that we have the line of text underneath the headline is a paragraph with a class of deck copy. So it's going to use that rule. And we'll go just take a peek at what that rule looks like. It looks like this. It's a centered bit of text that has a text size that is slightly larger than the main text, okay? If I now decide, because classes can get used more than once, if I decided that this paragraph now, I wanted to do the same thing, to it, I could attach the same class. Again, paragraph with a class of deck copy. If I did that, this last paragraph in this list that we've styled is going to change. You can see that now it's larger and it is also centered. It's no longer left justified. And it's happening again because of the CSS rule that says anytime you find a paragraph with a class of deck copy. Well, now, what about this? What if I make this no longer a paragraph, but I make it a heading 6 with a class of deck copy? And we close this off as a heading 6. What is going to happen to it? Well, I can tell you in advance, it will become different because the browser is going to try to control how H6s are styled, but it is going to ignore the particular sizing of the CSS styling for deck copy. It's also not going to be centered because up in the CSS we've said only do this if you find a paragraph with a class of deck copy. Since this is now at heading 6 with a class of deck copy, it's going to ignore that rule. So you'll see that it's done something different with it because it's an H6, but you also see that it's on the left and it's a totally different size than the default. It's not using the CSS rule coming up here because this again says only do this if it's a paragraph with a class of deck copy. So I think I'm going to avoid the other spacing issue for now, but just understand that's what that means. Same thing right here when we talk about spans now. This says anytime you find the span tag, if it also has the class of red, dot red, meaning the class of red, to do this. Make the color of the text the same dark red as the headline and also cause it to be bold. So bold red text anytime that you find the span with a class of red. We'll see that here in a second. So if I get rid of that H6 and I put it back to its standard paragraph, we end up back to where we were. Right now, I think what we're going to need to do, looking at time, is basically go copy everything else all in one quick whack and then start breaking it down. All right. Actually, we'll do all the way down there too. We'll just do the whole thing. Okay, so I'm basically just copying everything between the body tags from my styled page, the one that I did prior to the webinar. And we're just going to replace it with everything that we have live on there right now, just to speed this process up. All right, so continuing on, basically just the explanation of things. Again, the first thing is to talk about the span class with span with a class of drop cap. We're using this to control the styling of that letter W, the first letter in the first paragraph. Spans now, what are spans? Spans are inline level elements, meaning that they don't automatically force a new line and cause space to show up above and beneath them. And it basically says just do whatever I'm telling you to do for whatever comes between the span tags. So you can see that we've got an opening span tag here. It has a class of drop cap. And then we've got the closing span tag right there. So all it's attacking now is the letter W and nothing else. So the question is, okay, well, what have we asked it to do? Right here you see it just says period drop cap. And you might think, well, I don't understand. Why doesn't it say span dot drop cap? And the reason that is, it certainly can. The reason that is that it doesn't have to. Just this by itself creates a CSS rule that anytime someone were to call out the class of drop cap, it would immediately try to do this particular thing. It would try to make the font size 42 pixels. It would try to make the font size bold. It would choose a particular font family. In this case, we're using Times, which is a serif font. Make it a little more fancy. It's also supposed to make it the same dark red as the headline. And then we have some margin information. No margin on the top, -5 pixels on the left, and this is our first usage of a negative value. 0, I'm sorry, on the right, I said left, I think. Top right, bottom left. Again, if I misquoted that, I'm sorry. The top is 0, the right is -5, the bottom is 0, and the left is 0. Margins, you can have negative values for. Just note that you cannot have a negative value for a padding. And you'll see how this plays out here in just a second. At the moment, actually, let me just set the margin value to 0 so you can see the change and see how I came up with the -5 for the right. We'll go back to the live and we'll look at the text. Okay, so some strange stuff going on at the moment. Let's see. Here's the drop cap, which is what we're talking about at the moment. You'll see that there's this spacing here between the W and the E of welcome, and to me that just looks weird. The reason that's happening is because of the browser default margin that's being set to a letter basically that has a font height of 42 pixels. It's saying to you know, you see where it's showing up before the E, right? So in order to influence that and make this E start to move a little bit closer to that W is where the -5 pixels came into play, just so that you understand that. So top, on the right-hand side, I wanted -5 pixels, and then zeros on the bottom and on the left. And doing so, you'll see that the E is going to move closer over to the W, and it just looks a little bit better. So that's the understanding of negative margin values. Again, margins can have negative values where padding cannot. All right, let's take a quick look at the code. Why does this not look like? Maybe I didn't copy all the CSS over. That may be the case. Everything looks good, so unless Murphy's messing with me, and that was just that we just didn't bring over all the CSS. All right, so we have everything styled pretty much exactly the way that it was defined in the original. So now it's just quickly for me to kind of scan. So we're looking for how did we style the subheadlines? How did we style this particular unordered list, this bulleted list with the square images as if, or bullets basically rather than the default circles? And then how did we style the order box this way? And then how did we style these links? It's pretty much the bulk majority of this. So we'll start from the subheadlines. The subheadlines we're causing to be in H2. So we'll go look at the CSS up here for H2. All we've done is we've asked them to be text aligned equals centered, and we've asked them to be a particular color red. You've noticed that I didn't actually even assign a height value to them. There's no font size. I could have, I just didn't. So it's using the default browser height for an H2, just aligning it centered and coloring it red. Let's see, in regards to the unordered list, let's look at the HTML first. Again, anytime you want to build a bulleted list, you start with UL for unordered list. Again, it's also closed, closing UL. And each line item or list item is enclosed in the LI tag before and after it. All right. So by default, again, this would have created a bulleted list, but it would have been hard left because of the text align left set in the body, and it would have also used the circled, filled in disk icons for the bullet. So here's how we basically change that. Just these two simple pieces of CSS. The first thing I said was for the unordered list tag itself, I wanted a margin left of 100 pixels. So basically on the left-hand side, I wanted you to add 100 pixels of space. We also wanted to change the list style type, which is shown here. Rather than being the default, which is, if you don't call it out at all, it shows what's referred to as disk. In this case, I wanted to use the square. You should also note that by default there's three. There's disk, square, and there's also circle. Circle basically is a circular image similar to disk, but it's not filled in. So I'll show you that one. By default, if you're not using like an image to style, the check mark or something like that, if you don't put any list style type, you're going to get a disk or a filled in circle, or you can use the square that I just showed you, or you can use a circle that's not filled in, entirely up to you. Those are just the three that are built through CSS and don't require an actual image. Also, you'll notice that I've added some padding or some spacing above and beneath each list item. And this is what you need to know here. We have two selectors, UL and then LI. And here's basically what that means. It means look for any unordered list and then look for any list item that is inside of the unordered list. You basically start to the right and work your way to the left. So if you find a list item that is nested inside of an unordered list, then here's what I want you to do. I want you to add some padding or space above and beneath each list item. And you know that it's above and beneath because we have two different values. And again, if I said if you have two, the first refers to top and bottom, and the second refers to left and right. So I'm just adding a small amount of padding or space above and beneath each list item. If I take this away, again through the CSS comment to show you the difference, you'll see that it's just way too tight. The text just doesn't breathe. And we're looking at this list item right here. It's going to now show the circle not filled in bullet, and you'll see that the text just becomes too tight. That's the way it would look by default. So we've got a decent looking bullet, but that text just becomes really, really hard to read. So how we basically solve that was by styling the list items inside of the unordered list to have a little bit of space or padding above and beneath them. And so now we get this little more breadth, which makes the text that much easier to read. And we styled, or we pushed the list over with that margin left of 100 pixels. And I could move it, more or less depending upon, where I thought it should be, just by that margin left statement. Okay. Next, we'll talk about the content inside of the order box. We've already talked about the styling of the order box div by itself, but let's talk about the content inside of it. And then lastly, we'll talk about the footer area and we'll be done for today, and we'll take some questions. So in regards to the order box, come down here. You'll remember that we put it inside of its own division area, its own div, has a div ID of order box, and you can see that we use the CSS comments, I'm sorry, HTML comments to know when we closed the order box. And over here now we have a new div inside of a div. So just know that you can nest divs. Obviously you can put one inside of another. We've got an order button div that affects this area, and I simply just pasted in the form code I got from PayPal. Initially, however, and I should put that back real quick. Let me get the default URL for the button. Okay. Initially, when I got it from PayPal, it's going to give you a URL to a particular buy button image that's, you can see it's delivered straight from PayPal. So rather than an image being delivered from your own site, it's actually going over to PayPal to bring over the Buy Now button. This is the default code received by PayPal. I simply just pasted in the code, which was everything that happened here between form. I just pasted it in between a new div. In this case, I'm using a class, because I might want to use the order button multiple times on the page. That's the thought process behind that. But I want to style this area differently, because by default the button will be fixed to the left, and I don't want that. I want the button centered. So here's what this is. Again, we've got a div ID of order box, again, to style that light yellow area with a certain width and that dashed red border. Inside now I've got a paragraph, and I'm using another bit of CSS to say this one's special. This is kind of different than the rest. I'm also using a span inside of the paragraph. The span has a class of red. Basically just says make this text red. And I just want yes Joe in red. The paragraph class of special affects everything between the paragraph as well. So let's go take just a quick peek at the paragraph class of special and the span class of red. So up here, we've got both next to each other. So the paragraph class of special, I've said margin top 0. The reason is, excuse me, all block level elements, again remember, divs are block levels, so are all of your headings, so are your paragraphs. They all by default carry a certain amount of margin and or padding to them. As a result of that, I want to turn it off for this particular paragraph. The reason is whenever you have two block level elements sitting right next to each other, they both are having their they both have their margin assigned to them. So here's what I mean. Let me just add some junk text at the very bottom to show you. So let's say I wanted to an H2 and this will come up a lot when you're creating pages. And then right behind it, underneath that heading 2, we've got a paragraph. Okay, so the H2 is a block level element, which means two things. Number one, the browser is going to assign margin around it. It's also going to cause a hard line break, so that this next text, the paragraph, is going to come, not on the same line, but on a new line. However, paragraphs are also block level elements, so they then have margin above and beneath them. Because you have two block level elements sitting right on top of each other, it's the same thing when you have multiple paragraphs. Sometimes the combination of the margin beneath the heading to and above the paragraph makes the spacing too much. So sometimes you might have to control the spacing of one. So you can control the margin top of this particular paragraph, the one that I've highlighted here, and remove it and basically control that spacing. And I don't know if that makes a whole lot of sense, but I'm hoping that kind of gives you an idea. It typically only happens when you have two block level elements that sit on top of each other, which most of the time would be like a heading. In this case, though, it's not that. It's actually the div. Divs are also block level elements that cause margin to show up. And so we have a div followed by a paragraph. And the class of special then is basically just removing the margin top for this one paragraph such that we don't get this extra space. If I get rid of the paragraph class of special and just make it right back to a paragraph, a standard paragraph, and if we look at it, we'll see that we get this amount of space. This space above the paragraph now is what I was trying to avoid, and it's happening again because we have the padding plus the margin of this paragraph plus the margin of the div that this whole area is set inside. So in order to get rid of that additional spacing, we added that, we removed the margin with the class of special. So that's the hows and whys that was done. And you'll see that the spacing goes back to something that's more pleasant now. This area is really simple as far as the bold italicized. You'll simply see that all we did was use HTML tags, the B and the I, so bold and then italics. Again, remembering that the order has to be accurate. If you start from the inside, I, you should run into the I first, and then the same thing with the bold should be next. Let's see, span class of underline. Again, understand with spans, they're inline elements, they're not block level elements, so they're not causing margins and paddings. And anything that happens between the span class is what's being attacked, which in this case is only 1995. And the span class of underline, you can probably figure out what I've done. But all I've done is I've said anything that you find a class of underline used text decoration of underline. So it's underlined the only 995 bit of text. The Buy Now button, again, we've talked about, we pasted the code, but it's being attacked by the Order button class. I've set a particular width, so it's narrower than the width of the actual box that it's contained inside, which is 500 pixels. We've set the margin top and bottom to 0. The margin left and right to auto, which again is going to help it center it. And just as a fallback, even though there's no text inside of the button, we've set the text align to center. This is just a common practice that basically some browsers in the past have had trouble with centering just based on the margin. So a lot of times when you set margins to 0 auto for trying to center something, you also set the text align to center as well. Just a trick that I've come across over time. So that, because we have the whole PayPal button wrapped with a div class of Order button, is causing it to be a certain width, is causing it to be centered on the page. Okay? So that's what's happening there. Lastly, in regards to footer, is these links. So again, the A tag, the anchor tag, is what's being used to create links, in this case text links. They need at minimum at least one attribute of href, equals, and then in quotation marks, they need to go somewhere. So where do you want to send the user when they click? In this case, I've just I've added some dummy pages which represent real pages, but I didn't create them. So if we had created a page named terms.html, when the user clicked the text terms of services, or terms of service rather, it would take them to the terms.html page. Same thing with privacy policy. Clicking that text would take them to privacy.html. Clicking earnings disclaimer would take them to earnings.html. Remember that I said that in web development, a lot of times you simply just use the pound symbol or number sign as a placeholder for links. Specifically, if you don't know right at the beginning when you're creating them where they're going to go or what the page is going to be named, using the number sign or pound symbol between the quotes is completely appropriate to do as well. It just makes the link active. So again, anything that's between the A tag, which this is basically the full opening A, and the closing A tag is going to become linked. In this case, it's simply just text. I've used a space after the closing A tag, and I've just used what's called the pipe symbol. It's just a symbol you can type on your keyboard, maybe in a different place than it is for me, but if I get rid of it, for me it is right above the enter key on my keyboard, and I have to shift in order to get it. So that gives me what's called the pipe symbol, just a vertical line straight up and down. There's nothing special to it, it's just commonly used. So the question then is, okay, well, how is the links basically, how come they're not blue underlined? And the reason is that we're using CSS, and you're like, well, where is it? It's actually being controlled because those links live inside of the division with an ID of footer. So let's go up and explain that real quick. So here we are, and it's this little bit of CSS right here. The first says ID of footer, right? The ID meaning that it's got the pound sign before the word footer. This again says it's an A tag. Again, if you start from the right, this means anytime you find an A tag or a link that's also inside of the ID footer. If you do, then here's what you're to do. Number one, you're to cause the color of the text to be this dark gray. Number two, you're to remove the default text decoration of underline and to set it to none. So basically cause the link to be this dark gray color and then remove the underline with the text decoration property, text-decoration none. Now, if the user hovers over the actual text, I want you to do something different. This now brings up a new selector type. This is called a pseudo selector. I know this gets more complex, and we're still really at a pretty much of a basic kind of a CSS level here. We'll get a little more complex when we get into the PSD, but right now this is still relatively basic CSS, although we have built multiple layers throughout today. What this is saying is anytime that you find the A tag, again, inside of something that has an ID of footer, with the colon between them, and the word hover is what's referred to as the pseudo. So if the user hovers over the A tag text, what I want you to do is to underline it. So only underline it when they hover over it. Do not underline it until they do that. So again, that little bit of CSS right there is what's causing the area to be colored a certain way and to have the links styled a different way. The actual sizing of the text inside of it and the positioning of the text inside of it is happening because of the actual main footer ID CSS. Again, setting the width to 750, setting the color of all of the text, not just the links, to the same dark gray, and then aligning the text and then causing it to be a certain size. So that's actually controlled up here, whereas just the link styling is happening beneath. So we go back to the page again and we refresh, we should be all good. You'll see that all of the text down here is the dark gray, not just the links. And this color is actually being set up in the footer ID, and then the footer link styling, the A styling, is happening on those two lower CSS rules that we set or talked about just a minute ago. And you can see that as I hover over them, they become underlined, and if I don't hover over them, that they are not.